Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ian Forbes. I'm a fellow of the Institute and I'm a retired admiral from many years ago. Welcome to the latest in the military history program that RUSI runs. Before I go into any detail about our speaker today, can I just remind you that everything that is said, both during the presentation and in the Q&A, is on the record. And can I also ask you to pay attention to your mute buttons for obvious reasons. So today, you've seen the title and you've read Andy Young's CV. I think all I'm going to pull out is two pieces that struck me. The first is the depth of his experience in what I would call military education, laced with quite a bit of recent academia. And together with the fact that of his two key projects, from what I saw, one of the key ones was amphibious development. And that's what he's going to talk about today. He's going to take us back to the 7 Years' War, as I understand. He's going to pull some lessons out from that, and then he's going to relate them to today. And when I looked at the 7 Year War points that he'd made, I have to say that many of the personalities involved I had never seen before. So we've all got something to learn. So without any further ado, let me introduce Andy Young, and we very much look forward to him speaking for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll go to Q&A. Andy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sir Ian. If you just bear with me 1 second, I'll bring up my slides so that people can share the journey with me, if that's the right phrase to use. As Sir Ian has said, today I'm going to look at developing amphibious doctrine, and in particular through the prism of the 7 Years' War. Now, you may be asking, why do I want to even look at this? Surely it's anachronistic, it's esoteric, it's defined by its time, and there's nothing that we can learn from this in the 21st century. Having taught amphibious warfare courses, having studied this for the last 20 years, I can assure you that really there is nothing more pertinent to armed forces today than looking back at the abiding principles which some enterprising individuals first laid down some 270 years ago. Now, of course, when we think about doctrine, there are certain phrases that come to mind, things like the soul of warfare, a bag of snap-on tools, it's a philosophy of how we're going to fight and what we're, all of which skirts around the main issue, which is that doctrine and what it actually gives us is an operational answer to a strategic problem. You cannot have doctrine without understanding the strategic context of the world you're operating in, and not just the world you're operating in, but of what the problem is that you're trying to solve in order to achieve that political settlement. So when we look at doctrine, we've got to think about that direction piece. You don't make it, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. You don't make it in a vacuum. There is a purpose and a reason behind it. Second thing that we've got to think about when we're looking at doctrine is the actual process of how we make it. And it's very easy to say that, well, some very clever people go and sit in a room behind closed doors and they just come up with these concepts which they then give to people on the ground to go away and test and go, yes, no, that works, that doesn't. And actually, this is where the rubber meets the road, and your theory is entirely wrong. The alternative is that people go out and they just do it, and they make it up as they go along, and then when they get to the end of an operation, they say, oh, this worked, therefore that's our doctrine. It's actually somewhere in between the two. Doctrine, like any good practical application of knowledge, is informed by theory, and theory in itself it is informed by practice. So the two things happen together. If you don't do that, you end up in the sort of Einsteinian madness loop of always doing what you've done before and expecting different results. So you've got to be informed by practice, but you've also got to have that theory piece behind it. Now, as you can see, as I put up on the screen here, Kolb's learning cycle really is quite a useful method of understanding this process. And the reason I've gone for Kolb, and it might seem a bit left field for military history, is that this is current UK doctrine. We use Kolb in the UK's armed forces to talk about learning at the individual level. We talk about how individuals have these concrete experiences, particularly in experiential learning, so practical learning, these concrete experiences, i.e. what happened, they then reflect and observe on that experience. Okay, so we know what happened, why did it happen, how did it happen that way? And from that, we then go away and we think, well, what can we do better? We have abstract conceptualization of it. What improvements can we make to come to a different outcome or a better outcome? Following on from that, we then experiment with those outcomes. We don't just go and try the real life scenario again. We actually sit down, we do dry run tests, rehearsal of concepts, etc., etc. And we do this at an individual level. However, it's also applicable at organizational levels, although not many people have actually made that link. You can do this as part of that whole lessons identified, insights identified, and how you reorientate and reorganize yourself to actually hit that target or change, meet that operational requirement. As not just as an individual or a platoon or a division at sea or a flight, but as an entire armed forces. Because the key thing that you have in Kolb and actually in Doctrine is that this is not learning or doing something because what you're doing or learning is a good in itself, to use a Kantian phrase. It's actually for a purpose. This is purposeful activity. Therefore, what you do has meaning. And you have to completely go around this whole process and orientate yourself to achieving that end state. If you're doing something which doesn't achieve that end state, then it's purposeless. It has no utility, and that's something that we need to bear in mind when we're thinking about doctrine. We're thinking about concepts, particularly today for armed forces when they're thinking about what they're going to be doing in the future. They've got to come back to this idea of the so what is the purposeful activity I'm trying to undertake and why am I doing it? And therefore, how do my experiences, how does my observations, how does my abstract conceptualization, and finally, how does my experimentation lead me to actually delivering that objective, to delivering that strategic goal? So that's what is doctrine and how it is made. Of course, the big question is, so what in terms of the 7 Years' War? Surely there are other conflicts where we can see this happening and we can take examples from. And of course, the answer is yes, most definitely. The reason why I go back to the 7 Years' War is actually because you've got a complete change in the war aims, in the strategic concepts and the objectives to be met. Prior to the 7 Years' War, Britain would send its army off to Northern Europe, particularly the Low Countries, particularly under the early Hanoverian kings, George I and George II, in order to preserve Hanover or preserve the Low Countries. That's where the army's centre of gravity was. For the Royal Navy, it was going to be out in the Eastern Atlantic, or the Western approaches, as it were, dominating the French seaboard and preventing the French convoys and the French fleet getting to sea. So you have these two very divergent war activities, as it were. Not different purposes, but different activities. 7 Years' War comes around, and this is actually changed. Britain's centre of gravity, in terms of the conflict, wasn't going to be Hanover. It wasn't going to be fighting the French in Northern Europe, and it wasn't going to just be dominating the Atlantic and the Western approaches. The centre of gravity was going to be the colonies. It was going to be exporting British power and depriving France, Spain, whoever else of those colonies, stripping them away. And it's really an example of horizontal escalation as we know it today, or as Corbett would put it, or Clausewitz as well, limited by contingent warfare. You pick a target that the opponent cannot defend easily, and you go for it with relative mass at the decisive point. You deprive that from your opponent. So you've got these new war aims. And the direction for this is set by Pitt the Elder, the great commoner. He's brought into the government in 1757. And he says, no, we're changing the way of warfare that we've had in the past, and we're going to actually make the army and the navy work together to achieve these new aims. To do that, he had to co-opt a George Lord Anson, who was first Sea Lord and Lord of the Admiralty, and Field Marshal John Legenier. John Legenier was a cavalryman by trade, and he'd spent the previous two major wars in Northern Europe fighting cavalry battles against the French. Anson, similarly, he was a deep sea blue ocean officer. He had very little experience, if any, of amphibious operations. Pitt was able to co-opt both these individuals, both who had a very different view of how armed forces should be used from their own experience, and he was able to say, no, this is what we're going to do, and this is what I expect you to do. So there was clear direction from the centre. Now, why else the 7 Years' War? Well, because there are very few examples, very few clear examples of armies and navies or joint forces actually operating conjunctly up until fairly recently. This is one of the first examples, and decisively adapting a new methodology in a time of crisis against a peer one opponent with complete parity. And that needs to be said quite clearly. This is a high intensity conflict against someone who has similar, if not parity in terms of arms, in terms of resources, in terms of personnel, and in terms of technology. And you're adapting an entirely new way of war against, whilst also fighting them on what is their terms to begin with. There are very few examples of this. This is the first one I found. And actually, this does show quite clearly that it can be done, but it requires thought, and it requires patience, and it requires care to be taken. It's also important because Britain's experience in this type of warfare, amphibious warfare, prior to the 7 Years' War was completely underwhelming. And I'll go into that in the next bit. But suffice to say that when we started this conflict, at the start of this conflict, there was no expectation that we would be successful in it. The previous conflicts hadn't gone particularly well. It had always ended up status quo antebellum, so returning to where we were before. And the experience of amphibious operations was really that we shouldn't really attempt this because it never ends well. So those concrete experiences where it didn't end well. And I've picked out three. Two which occurred prior to the 7 Years' War, and one which occurs right at the beginning of the 7 Years' War, for these examples. Why? Because these examples come through in the documentation of the time. First is the Cartagena expedition in 1741, where the British suffer 90% casualties amongst their personnel. And the two officers commanding, the naval component and the land component, Admiral Vernon and General Wentworth, basically conceived of such a hearty dislike to each other that they refused to operate together. And so the army is left to perish from disease, the navy loses several ships and a lot of its sailors, and they limp back to Jamaica, and the whole thing ends in ignominy. Meanwhile, the Spanish are laughing because they had no idea that the British could be so foolish as to try and take a position at the height of the malaria season. And they were severely weakened at this point anyway. So they came out of it rather well. The second example is that of the raid on Lorient, where 5,500 British troops descend on the relatively ill-prepared city of Lorient, which is on the southern Breton coast. Spend a few days trying to encamp in front of the town. However, it's October, it's getting wet, it's getting rainy, the wind is getting up, the fleet cannot maintain its position, and the army is too small to actually do anything. It's only 5,000 strong. The defenders of Lorient account for about 15,000 militia. So within a few days, the British pack up, return to their ships and go home. Again, it's a bit of a damp squib. We lost about 2,000 personnel to sickness and disease, and nothing much was achieved by it. And the final one, Rochefort, is key because there are two individuals who come out of it. Now, Rochefort is a 1757 raid. It's Pitt's first adventure as the secretary or the Southern Department, secretary for the Southern Department in Newcastle's government, and mounted a raid of 10,000 strong army against Rochefort. This raid departs in September. It turns up off Rochefort. The weather's deteriorating. We don't know where the French fleet is, and they've got no intelligence. The army has no intelligence of the defences of Rochefort, and so they sit around on their ships. They bombard the Ile d'Aix, which you can see in the picture. But funny enough, they pack up and go home as soon as it becomes clear that the weather's deteriorating. There are official inquiries into Cartagena, into Lorient, and into the raid on Rochefort. And a couple of things come out of them. One is the commanders have no experience and they dislike each other. And two, all of these operations are ad hoc. They're hastily planned and they're hastily executed with little accurate intelligence. Now, the two officers who show up on the scene at this point are Captain Thomas Moore Walinger, who's a guards officer. He's Oxbridge educated, so he's a bit of a rarity. And he's already started writing on military doctrine by 1757. He's already published once. And he conceives of the Rochefort expedition as his muse. It shows, in his words, a lack of unanimity and an insufficiency of system. The other person who turns up now is Lieutenant Colonel James Wolfe, later Major General Wolfe of Quebec fame. And he is the Quartermaster General during the Rochefort expedition. And what he has to say about Rochefort gets him into trouble to the extent whereby he asks his friends to burn his letters. But they're there, they have this concrete experience, and both of them go away and stop and think about it. They engage in reflective observation. So Molyneux is probably the one that we need to focus on most, because he writes most of this, he writes this huge tome. It's a very thick tome called Conjunct Expeditions. And the first thing he says is this: that the frequent ill success of our conjunct armaments was owing to a want of system and a general insufficiency in this kind of war. But very little reflection on this on the return of the Rochefort armament convinced us thoroughly of this. And he writes this right at the start of his paper, and then he repeats it at the end of part 1. Now, this reflective observation is intriguing, because he then decides to do a survey going back to the Elizabethan period, and he works out that in the preceding 200 years, Britain has carried out no fewer than 68 conjunct expeditions, of which 38 ended in failure. So we've not got a great track record on this. However, by doing this, he's able to identify the litanies of failure, that lack of unanimity, method, system, the ignorance of the officers, and the petty jealousies between commanders. And he also identifies this lack of a coherent system or doctrine, the failure to delineate command and control, the lack of resource and mass when you're actually conducting these expeditions, the land component being deficient in all arms capability, and also deficient and lacking intelligence, as well as the lack of specialist equipment and connectors to actually be able to project your power ashore. All the things which we now take for granted in our amphibious operations. And they're actually being written about, as you can see, in 1758. This is when he's writing it, this is when he's practicing it, and this is what he's thinking about. So you can trace directly back to Thomas Moore Molyneux and say, right, this is where amphibious art was first defined, first laid down. And it really is the birth of an amphibious doctrine in that sense. Now, Molyneux lays down that there are 3 elements to an amphibious operation: the approach, which is the Royal Navy's job, which he doesn't really count. He says that's the sine qua non. And then he says you've got the landing, the operations ashore, and the withdrawal. And these will be identifiable to today's practitioners. Now, Wolfe, when he's thinking about it, and he's thinking about Rochefort, And he comes to it very much from the practitioner perspective of being a commander. And it's very interesting what he says here, which is that you have to actually admit that this failure needs to teach us something. Now, this is from the same man who a couple of years earlier said that our commanders are bigoted to new ideas. So it's very interesting that he's taking his experience of being a reformer of infantry tactics, and now he's applying it to the practice of amphibious operations. Shouldn't really be a surprise because he's that kind of character, and as you can see here, this is the type of man who would eschew his own normal sidearm, which would be a half sword, and instead he insists on going to Canada with a musket and bayonet. Sounds very egalitarian and very different to other officers of his time. But this is the reflective observation that they have. They look at what happens at Rochefort, they decide it wasn't good enough, we need to change it. So they go into abstract conceptualization. And Molyneux does this very effectively, and he outlines techniques, tactics, techniques, and procedures. And he does it in order to discover our own thoughts, our inventions, to reduce, if possible, this amphibious kind of warfare to a safe and secure and regular system. He tries to take luck and the caprices of nature, as he puts it, out of the equation. Wolfe differs in this. He says that war is hazardous and an option of difficulties, so you're not going to get it right. But Wolfe as well lays down a whole raft of things that admirals and generals should be doing if they are conducting amphibious operations. This includes things like having landing craft, specialist connectors, that you can fight from and that you have a designated lift capacity for, including inshore artillery support. There should be a method for all arms brigade level post beach landings. Walinger comes up with that. You need the different types of operations to be carried out ashore. Well, that requires a different laydown again. There needs to be methods and manuals and for the dispositions of your troops, both when they're landing and in the recovery. And the recovery is very vitally important. Molyneux witnesses at St. Cas in 1758 a disastrous withdrawal from a beachhead. Molyneux also comes up with a proposal for an all-arms legion of amphibious troops. This is the first time in British history that we have this idea of having an amphibious corps, separate from the Marines, but an amphibious corps who are designated for this purpose. But he also says, look, if you're going to be doing amphibious operations, raids are not the way forward. Raiding achieves very little, it wastes resources, it uses up a huge amount of lift capacity, and it doesn't really give you the gains that you're expecting from it. If you're going to use this stuff, use this amphibious capability, it needs to be targeted where the enemy is weak. And it needs to be this horizontal escalation piece. Interestingly, the same argument is made by Laycock in 1944, reference commando raids. Make of that what you will. So then we go into the active experimentation phase. You have a repeated descent at St. Malo in early 1758, then at Cherbourg, and then back to St. Malo in late 1758. And it's the latter one at St. Malo where a brigade or a battalion of guards are basically wiped out on the beach. 800 troops lost. Why? Because they didn't conduct an orderly withdrawal. But what's really interesting here is that you have these individuals who start learning their trade. These are the same troops who are used time and time again to learn the trade of being amphibious forces. We start seeing inshore squadrons being detailed. We start seeing specific landing barges being used. And these are really used to great effect in the 1758 Louisburg campaign, where Wolfe appears as a brigade commander. And he uses the greater maneuverability of his landing craft to outflank the French defences, to get behind them, and then to set up the position for the taking of Louisburg. Roll around 1759, he's proven his spurs as a formation commander. He's then given general officer command of the Quebec expedition. This sails with 10,000 troops, most of whom have been present either at Louisburg or all of these descents. So they're all seasoned amphibious troops. And he goes to Quebec, sails up the St. Lawrence to Quebec. They have accurate intelligence. They know what's waiting for them. And he wages a campaign which memorably ends on the height, or not on the Heights of Abraham, but after the Heights of Abraham, when the Royal Navy hauls guns up. They've defeated the French army that came out to meet them. They haul the guns up and they pound Quebec into the ground over the next week. What's interesting about this is that in his orders, Wolfe actually demonstrates all the things that we'd expect to see today. Command and control of the landing craft, how that is delineated, where the troops should go upon landing, the close fire support from naval gunfire support, that's first delineated there. He's got all the actions on. So all of these things that we would expect to see in modern orders are present in Wolfe's orders at the time, as well as this little fascinating snippet, which is officers and men will remember what their country expects of them. Funny old thing, where do we hear that later? England expects. Nelson knew who he was emulating in 1805. And there's no coincidence that Nelson asks to be memorialized as Wolfe was memorialized by Benjamin West. And so you can actually trace this direct lineage, direct line from these very different individuals who learned a different method of warfare, but were both radical in their own way. So why is this important? Why is any of this important to us today? Because fundamentally what this doctrine, the conjunct expeditions, shows us is that there is a golden thread that links government policy to tactics, techniques, and procedures. And if we don't actually think about that, then we're going to set ourselves up for failure. It also shows how you evolve this in time of war, and you go from these ad hoc, we're just going to respond and we're going to try and be opportunistic, to actually coming up with a method of warfare which is incredibly successful. Post 1759, Britain conquers the world, and it's no coincidence. We are able to launch amphibious operations at will from Havana to Manila, and we do those two operations in the same year. So it is key. You have to actually understand this stuff to understand how we came to the point where we did. And indeed, you can trace this bit through the next 60 years. And in 1798, there's a government civil servant who writes a report, and he is directly quoting from Thomas More Molyneux, somebody who died 20 years earlier and who wrote 40 years earlier. And if you can trace it to 1798, you can trace it to 1858 or 1898 as well. So there is this golden thread that goes all the way through and lays the foundations. I think most importantly, though, is that the abiding principles, the idea of mass isolation of the objective, that this is part of a horizontal escalation strategy, that you've got to have enough resource to meet the needs of the objective, the specialist equipment, personnel, connectors, and that your personnel have to be educated and experienced in this type of warfare. All of this comes back to this individual, comes back to Thomas More Molyneux and as the theoretician, and James Wolfe as the arch practitioner. Now, of course, the abiding thing that comes out, or the lasting thing that comes out of Thomas More Molyneux, apart from all of those perennial things, is this idea, and he comes to it very clearly, that practice informs theory and theory informs practice. And he says it very clearly throughout, but he ends the entirety of this 400-page tome with this idea that if you go into something using only your body, you're stressing your mental faculties even further. If you're not thinking about this beforehand, if you're not preparing yourself mentally, you are setting yourself up for failure. And if you do that, you're actually dishonoring your country, is the way he puts it. But in today's terms, if you do that, you are going to set up the whole country for failure. You're not going to achieve your mission. And actually, in terms of being a professional, if you're not thinking, you're not a professional. And it all comes back to these individuals. And certainly it's why I come back to it time and time again. So when we think about things today, such as how the UK MOD is having to adapt, having to change itself to become better, more globally deployed, to coming up against divergent threats and risks, etc. If we can go out and we can be as busy as we want, but if we don't put the groundwork in thinking about what it is we aim to achieve and how we can do that most effectively, we're going to go round and round, as Walinger says, in a continued round of bad management. Thank you. I will stop sharing.
Are you, Andy, are you complete or are you still going?
All complete. Sorry.
Okay, good. Right, well, thank you very much. We've got one question at the moment and I'll read it out. And I think given the timing, we've probably got about 30 minutes. So we need a few more questions, please, from the 37 participants that we got this far. I'll read this first question and hope that we'll see some more. Thank you anyway for a very thought-provoking analysis, and we'll come back to that word when I have a question. Anyway, let me read the first one out. Hang on. Okay, this is from Alex Walchester. Do you believe that the difficulties with the withdrawal are the primary reason for making raiding undesirable? And what do the lessons of the 7 Years' War impact the latest UK amphibious doctrine for raiding? Well, that's my first question gone. So well done, Alex. Please, over to you, Andy.
So it's a really interesting question. I think if you read Walinger, he's actually quite clear. The reason why they had, for example, a difficulty with withdrawal at St. Cas was because the army thought they could get away clean. And they didn't actually come up with a safe and secure method for the re-embarkment over an open beach. So it's not a question of the withdrawal itself, it's a question of the preparation of the withdrawal. So that's the primary thing there. Now, in terms of the efficiency or efficacy of raiding, Walinger is really clear on this, and actually Laycock says something very similar. Which is that you only do raiding if there's nothing else you can do. It is a weak option. You're doing it because you do not have the mass or the capability of being able to actually take and hold somewhere. And the other point to this, so that was the first point, it's a weak option. Unless you've got something really specific, something special forces like, such as, and I'll use a couple of examples here, the raid on Bruneval, for example, that really merited it. But 9 times out of 10, if you're going to do a raid, it's for gathering intelligence. It's not as an operation in and of its own right. So that's something to bear in mind. The second part in this was, and it relates to that resource question about if you're going to do something, you've got to do it right. Is so you're going to put a descent onto the coast of France, or onto any other spot in the world for that matter. So what? What is that going to achieve? Well, actually, to achieve anything of any meaningful value, you've got to take and hold it. Well, if you're going to take and hold it, then it needs to be at sufficient mass and resource. And for you to put in an amphibious towhold on a coastline anywhere in the world, that requires a huge logistical chain in order to support it. Now, why are you going to do that? What is the point in it? Well, you're going to do that as a means of leapfrogging onto other operations and to punching out and to going on to the offensive, as we see in 1942, in 1943, in 1944, and then across in the Pacific throughout the Pacific campaign. And we see that again in 1982. That's why you do these kind of operations. You don't do them in order to try and tie down enemy troops somewhere, or because if you take that piece of ground, you've got to hold it, you've got to keep it supplied, and that's a huge logistical effort. We tried this on several occasions with insufficient mass, insufficient force, not just during the 7 Years' War, but in those 68 examples that that Walinger talks about. And Walinger comes to the same conclusion as the rest of the British establishment in 1758, and he says these things might look good, and Frederick the Great might think they're a good idea, but actually they waste resource, they waste blood, treasure, and it diverts effort away from more meaningful employment elsewhere. And so they end. In 1944, Laycock says the same thing about the commando raids. He says they're not actually depriving the enemy of anything, they're depriving us of personnel, very, very scarce personnel and resource, and they're just reinforcing the coastline that we actually want to go and invade in the coming weeks. And you see this repeated throughout history. If you're going to do raiding, it's got to be for a very specific purpose. You're not doing it for the sake of doing it. And so we come back to mass and resource. Now, interestingly, Winston Churchill knew this and understood this in 1940. It's why he directed that the Royal Marines were to form an amphibious division. So that was going to be 3 brigades of amphibious infantry who could go and do large-scale amphibious assaults. The amphibious infantry idea fell flat from the Royal Marines for 2 reasons. One, because the Royal Navy needed the manpower for the Royal Marines. The Royal Marines were never formed as an amphibious force on that scale. That was never their purpose from 1755 to 1945. And 2, because the specialist land equipment that you need to be a combined arms force, where are you going to get that from? You're going to get that from the army. What's the army trying to do? Well, the army's trying to fight a land war in North Africa, and latterly in Northern Europe. They don't have the artillery, engineers, logisticians to spare to pass over to a division of Royal Marines whose purpose nobody quite gets. So when you come back to the whole raiding piece, you've got to think about what is the direction, what is the intent, what resource have you actually got, where can it best be used, and think about why you're doing these raids. Because if it's just to prove a point, if it's just to say we're still in the fight, then actually that's resource that can be better used elsewhere.
Okay, Andy, well, thanks. Well, look, I'm just going to come with a supplementary, because I'm trying to read between Alex's questions lines. It seems to me that the key question is what is in the strategic review, the integrated review of whatever it was 12 months ago, has it got it right on raiding, or has it got it wrong? And I only need really 2 sentences in response, because we're building up to about 8 other questions. Over to you.
I think it is at the moment, raiding is an answer to a problem that hasn't been set. That we are trying to find ideas to do with reduced mass, but we're not actually putting the pieces of the puzzle together and saying, if you are actually going to be an expeditionary force, then your army and your navy need to work together on this. We're diverging. We are divergent. We are not convergent. And unless we actually bring those two forces together, 3 forces when you include the Royal Air Force, it's going to be a case of trying to make do and mend with what you have. And actually, that's not the way forward. That's just that bad management that he talks about.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, let me go to question 2. Bear with me. And it was just Tim Fish, I think, was the first one in the line. Were earlier attempts at amphibious warfare all really that bad? Wasn't some experience in previous conflicts, especially in the War of the Spanish Succession, prove some aspects of the doctrine that emerged in 7 Years' War? So a historical question for you, Andy, and if we could limit it to 3 minutes, because they're building up pretty fast. Yeah. And I want to cover them all. Over to you.
No problems. So this is why Molyneux goes back and he does the survey. He looks at things like Gibraltar and he says it's successful, hugely successful. Why is it successful? Well, because we've taken hold with sufficient mass, sufficient logistics. And bearing in mind, Gibraltar is taken, yes, it's taken by Marines, but they're Army Marines, they're not Navy. And it's a huge logistical effort in order to support it. So it goes back to that other point. What is clear and is there, though, is that between the War of Spanish Succession, which ends in 1712, and the War of Jenkins' Ear in 1739, nobody has experience of this. You've got an entire generation of officers who have absolutely no experience of amphibious operations. Now, you are going into a war without anybody having written anything, without anybody having any practical experience, and you're expecting these operations to work like clockwork. That's not going to happen. That's why Walinger was writing. He was saying we need to actually write this down, we need to think about it, and we need to prepare our people more effectively. They need the education as well as the practical experience. You're muted, sir, sorry. Still muted, Siri, sorry.
Okay, right, we'll start again. Okay. What would Molyneux and Wolfe think of the Royal Marines' future commando force restructuring?
Oh, heavens. Well, it's interesting that both of them are army officers. And I think that says it all, really. Bear in mind that the Royal Marines were a new concept, or the Marines, the Corps of Marines were a new concept in 1755. Yes, they'd been around and disbanded prior to that, but as a naval establishment, they're a new concept. I think they probably would disagree with the idea that you're going to achieve significant outcomes with reduced mass. What is clear from all of their thinking is that you need mass and you need the combined arms force. Unfortunately, the Future Commando Force has neither. And one has to wonder as to why it is composed in the way it is. That's not to say it's wrong. If the mission is there and the direction that is there is clear, then it is perfectly feasible. And actually, I would say that the Future Commando Force actually takes the Royal Marines almost back to where they were originally, which is doing the three things which they're currently doing at the moment: ships protection through 4-2 Commando, interdiction and boarding 4-2 Commando, and then small scale raiding from ships without taking a holding ground, which is 40 and 4-5. So it is going backwards to a traditional format. I'm just not quite sure whether they'd agree that they should be the only amphibious holders.
Okay, we have the next one from Henk Warner. To what extent was there debate in this period with others that had other opinions? I'm probably talking to a Dutchman, I'm not sure, but okay, Andy, over to you.
So I'm assuming here, and it might be my assumption, that you're talking about the divergence in thought about what the armed forces are for Navy and Army. The Army starts the period under the Duke of Cumberland and very much focused on fighting in northern Germany. That doesn't end well in 1757 with Gloucester sailing. Actually, what's really key and important here is the fact that Anson and Legionnier bypass many of their senior commanders, and they start choosing commanders who are much more junior. Why? Because these are individuals who can be relied upon to actually carry out the direction as garnered from the top. Now, Pitt wins the argument over what type of war is going to be fought, and he is the man who then delivers the direction right from the top, right from George II. Remember, George II is the soldier king. This is not second nature to him. He doesn't really get amphibious operations until Pitt persuades him of their utility. And once he starts to see them succeeding under people like Wolfe, he actually says, bring me more wolves. I want more generals like Wolfe. If he's mad, let him bite some of my other generals. So it's very clear that there is this discussion, but Pitt's party wins out on it.
Thank you. Joe, from Joseph Moretz. Did 18th century practitioners understand raiding as a feint to support a larger operation being executed elsewhere? You may have covered that in the first question, but I don't think it was as precise.
No, absolutely, they did. So you see this actually happening, and demonstrations and feints happening all the time when they're actually conducting amphibious operations. So, for example, St. Malo, there's a feint on St. Malo where the main force actually go towards Cancale, and this again, you see raids and descents up and down Gaspé and Nova Scotia by Wolfe and Murray in 1758. So it does happen, and you also see it in the Quebec campaign. In the Quebec campaign, Wolfe makes a feint further upriver, then lands elsewhere. And so it's all there. It is all there.
Okay, so we have another from Tim Fish. Does the US Marine Corps Expeditionary Advanced Base Operations Stand-in Force concepts merge both raiding and landing types of operations? How does this fit into amphibious conceptual development?
I think it's a very different concept of ops when you're operating across the vastness of the Pacific Ocean versus what you're doing with in the Atlantic or Northwest Europe. I think it's trying to meld two divergent mission sets and set the US Marine Corps up with a unique capability which it can then offer as a solution to the question of how do you engage China when China's doctrine means that you're not going to get close into shore. So I think it's a very specific. It'll be interesting to see how it operates in practice. I mean, it's still very early days, really. In terms of the raiding and the holding ground, and are they at sufficient mass is my question, and do they have the logistical tail to enable it? If they don't, then it begs more questions than it answers.
Thank you. And one from Ian Speller. Thank you for an excellent presentation. You argue that there is a golden thread linked to Molyneux, which continues to impact positively on British ops in the decades that follow. How then do you explain the rather poor performance in amphibious operations during the French Revolutionary Wars prior to the success of Aboukir Bay in 1801?
So no, Ian, you're absolutely spot on. What I was referring to was the fact that Molyneux, we don't know how well what Molyneux was read at the time. And there's very little evidence of that. But what's really interesting is that we see him being used at a policy level in 1798. And of course, what's really interesting in terms of the development of amphibious capability and the way that the British Armed Forces actually were able to use this most effectively is that it's in this period, in the latter period, the 1795 to 1815 period, that Britain is engaged at the pinnacle of its amphibious capability and against a tier one opponent of equal standing, if not greater in some respect. Now, the question is, would we have got there had we not had this experience prior? And I don't think we do. Why? Because we don't have people like Hood, we don't have people like Howe, we don't have people like Wolfe for these individuals to look up to. We don't have their writings, we don't have their orders, we don't have all of these things which actually impact how we think about warfare, whether on a conscious or subconscious level. None of this is there. If you think about amphibious warfare and you think about the lasting impact of the 7 Years' War and Molyneux and his contemporaries, one of the great toasts of the age, military toasts of the age, was, "May I have the eye of a hawk and the heart of a wolf." That's cultural. That's embedded into the subconscious. So yes, every experience has to be relearned the hard way in some respects. But if you don't have this idea that, you know what, we've been successful at this before, you're not even going to attempt it again. You're going back to the square roots. So yes, we relearn lessons, but there is a cultural understanding there that we would not have had it not been for these individuals and for this experience in the 7 Years' War.
Okay, thanks. From Nick Howgill, how difficult is it to ensure that the Chimera of amphibious operations does not become a waste of resources by being an end rather than a means to an end?
And this comes back to that question of direction. What is the strategic context and what is it that you're hoping to achieve? Because it's all very well having a capability, but if it isn't aligned to that, then it's rather useless, and well, not useless, but it lacks utility. So it does come back to that direction. Unfortunately, the way all organisations are set up is that when they're left with a problem to solve on their own, they go back to what they know, and that's not necessarily the right thing. So it'll be interesting to see why we conceive or how we conceive of amphibious warfare and joint warfare actually solving the strategic problem. We've got multi-domain integration. This was multi-domain integration in the 1750s. actually, we've now got to think about it in an entirely different way. And this is just one part of that toolbox, but it's got to be linked to that broader level discussion and that higher level direction for an understanding of what is the strategic problem you're trying to solve.
Thank you. And David Stead, thank you for the very clear answer to the raiding question. This is what Laycock had to say at Russia in 1947. Stand by. All I would say is this: in the coming of age of BW and atomic horrors and what not and so forth, where you have widely dispersed and carefully concealed factories, installations and stocks of raw materials and finished articles, which are vital to the enemy, then surely there must be terrific scope for long-range reconnaissance and sabotage raids.
And there absolutely are, but that comes back to the whole idea about having special forces. You don't organise your entire armed forces around a special forces methodology. You use them as one part of the tool. When you are conducting major peer-on-peer interstate warfare, however, as we see in Ukraine today, you need mass and you need resource, and those have to be directed effectively. Small-scale raiding, it has its part to play, but if you're raiding for raiding's sake, it's not part of the lexicon. So yes, absolutely strategic raids, and I'm thinking things like Grunewald or as you see the Ukrainians conducting deep into enemy-held territory. Yes, absolutely, these are of importance. Other raiding is intelligence gathering, but actually the bulk of the operational output is done by conventional means.
And again, another one from Tim Fish. Thank you, Tim. Corbett's England in the 7 Years' War highlights the difficulties in getting this kind of warfare approved and sustained throughout the conflict. It was a unique situation of circumstances and people. Is it too hard to replicate now to get the confidence of military and political backing to conduct this type of warfare again?
Now there's a question. I would hope it isn't. But it does come back to, as you said, it's that unique context and the hard-fought battle between the pit party, the globalists almost, as it were, and the continentalists. And of course, the two things are not mutually exclusive. The very reason that Pitt is so successful is that he's unable to persuade those in power that his idea has merit. It's the fact that he maintains an army of 40,000 personnel in Germany. That placates the king, that placates the Duke of Newcastle, and he's then able to direct the bulk of British forces into these amphibious operations. So you've got these competing interests all the way through. I think the key thing is, and it comes back to, as I've said before, it's this idea of direction. You've got to have somebody with the vision and the willpower and the political capital and the empathy, the EQ factor, to be able to take people on that journey with him, and to be able, or them, or her, and be able to persuade the divergent parties and the divergent interests that actually this way is best. That's then got to be followed up by success, because success breeds success. It gains momentum all of its own. I don't think it's out of our grip or out of our reach, but I do think it requires some very, very much more thought out processes and policies.
Thank you. And this one chimes a little bit with that, but I think it's got enough definition in it. We do not, it's James London, by the way, we do not have a pit. Do you sense that our politicians have any genuine interest in ensuring a balanced armed force capability exists, or are they merely providing a bare sufficiency and plenty of hope, question mark? The IR and DCP seem to have been aiming to do much with little. Do you have a comment on this?
Ever was it thus? We've always thought we can achieve more with less than perfect means. I think the key thing here is, do we, and the key point of this question is, do we have enough strategic thinkers? The answer to that is no. The Public Accounts Committee has said this on numerous occasions. There have been numerous reports into this. Strategic thinking is not something we are good at anymore. And not just us, most places suffer with it. So actually that comes down to education, and it comes down to a wider, broader view of what is in the public interest and in the public good, which actually transcends party lines in many respects. The key thing that we've got to remember here is that none of this would have been possible. None of British victories in the 7 Years' War would have been possible were it not for the state of the public finance, the public purse, and for the fact that Pitt was able to draw on huge mercantile reserves in order to achieve these outputs. And also, don't forget, the entire amphibious force was transported in merchant ships. There was no amphibious fleet. These were ships taken up from trade. Look to the Falklands. What were we using? Ships taken up from trade. Do we have that shipping capability today? If you are going to do peer-on-peer interstate conflict, and if you're going to try and become expeditionary, you need to have a secure merchant marine. If we are, and that in turn builds prosperity through trade, etc. So I think we've got to think strategically, but it's got to be more than just military. Our resilience has got to be far deeper, far broader, and that resilience in and of itself can be weaponized when required.
Okay, any last one from what I would call the participation? Tim Fish again. 3 Commando Brigade CO Brigadier Cantrill has said that FCF provides a shaping force, allowing the entry of larger forces. So the raiding has a purpose. I think you might have answered already, but would you like to add?
Yeah, great, fantastic. Where's the larger force? Because at the moment, the larger force is concentrated on Brit, it's concentrated in Eastern Europe, and it comes back to this idea. When Walinger was talking about his amphibious legion, he was saying that you've got these shaping forces, i.e. these rangers, and he refers to rangers, interestingly, but he talks about rangers, reconnaissance forces, the people who go ahead and provide that knowledge of the battle space and so on and so forth. They're part of it. FCF, absolutely, if it's part of that, brilliant. But where's everything following it up from? 5 Infantry Brigade was mobilised to go down to the Falklands in 1982 because we required further mass. How much amphibious operation experience did those troops have? Conversely, if, as was most likely, we were going to be dispatching 3 Commando Brigade into Germany or into Northern Europe to fight tank battles, how much experience did they have of that? You can't expect troops to just pick up these roles without actually preparing them for it. So yes, FCF, it might be the shaping force, it might not. There's debate around that, but ultimately, even if it is the shaping force, where's the mass coming for the follow-on for the conventional? Because at the moment we don't see that. Look at the Army's woes in terms of its procurement. How many of its armoured vehicles can we get onto a landing platform dock or a landing ship auxiliary? Very few is the answer. So in terms of you can have a shaping force all you want, but its utility is limited if there's nothing following it up.
Okay, we're running out of time fast. I'm going to skip Tim's 4th question. I think that's only fair. I'll go to Charlotte. Do you really think that during the 18th century they didn't see a geopolitical wind to raiding and grabs, given that Manila, Havana, Madras, Louisbourg were bargaining chips at the various pieces? And was there any observation or interest in how, e.g. colonists had made their own, colonialists had made their own raids, as was Louisbourg Mark I? That might mean more to you than it does to me.
Yeah, so Louisbourg Mark I was 1745. The New England militia actually launched this assault. And it's interesting that the first successful amphibious operation of the 7 Years' War is Fort Saint-Beauséjour, which again is a predominantly militia, colonial militia piece. It's not that raiding isn't important. Raiding is important. But what Molyneux says quite clearly is there's no point raiding the coast of France. There's no point raiding your continental neighbour unless you're going to follow it up with something bigger. So that's very key. In terms of the colonial piece, you see a very different perspective between 1748 and the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle and 1763 and the Peace of Paris, where we keep those things that we have taken by and large, predominantly Canada, and Florida and some of these other, and yes, we use Havana as a bargaining chip. Why do we give certain places back? Because mercantile interests tell us that we need to. If we keep Cuba and Guadeloupe, we kill off the British sugar islands. So there is a mercantile interest piece there. Raiding does have a purpose, but these things are important when you combine them with the economic and political outcomes that you're seeking to achieve.
Okay, we have 2 minutes to run, so I'll take the license, if I may. Technology is moving very fast. We live in an era of immense technological speed and variety. Is that making a difference? Question. That's the first piece. The second piece is that we're rather priding ourselves, I think, on the fact that we know quite a lot about amphibiosity with our historical reference and everything else. Could you just give a comment on whether others are up with our pace or are equivalent? Are the Chinese looking seriously at Taiwan, et cetera, et cetera? Try and do that in 2 minutes.
So technology-wise, there is a question about whether the pace of technology is such today that it bypasses everything else. I'd argue actually that you just look at the technological pace from 1750 through to 1850, and you see much larger and much more advances in it. I think we're actually slowing down, and there's some data which has been done on that. Does it change how we do things? Yes, that's the evolving nature, character of war. And Molyneux understood that, and Wolfe understood that. One of Molyneux's things was that you never invent a piece of kit unless you can adapt it for future use, or it is multi-purpose. He's very clear on that. He's seen as a bit of an eccentric at the time as a result. In terms of our cultural affinity with amphibious warfare, I'd argue that we don't actually have one. We think we have one, but it's quite clear that we don't really do anything amphibious at scale between 1815 and 1915, with the clear exception of the Crimea, and that doesn't exactly go well. So I think in terms of cultural affinity that we've actually got a lot to relearn, and hence going back to the original documentation is quite useful. In terms of other actors, they've got to start from scratch, full stop. And that means it's incredibly difficult for them, because if they've got and it comes back to what Molyneux was saying, if you don't have experience about it, if you've not studied it, if you've not thought about it well enough, trying to do it from scratch, you're going to set yourself up to fail. There are going to be costly mistakes. And so when it comes to, for example, China versus Taiwan, there are some clear deficiencies that you can see in those forces.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a great line to finish on. All I would say is that, as I trucked down to the Falklands many years ago, and I'm allowed to say this, and saw our amphibious operation and preparation ops and everything else going into being, I thought an awful lot of it drew on tradition and previous experience, not necessarily our previous experience, but the service's previous experience. Anyway, so I'd like to thank everybody for all the questions. Thank you very much indeed. I think it's been a very rich session. And I just hope at the end of all this, Andy, that the right people are listening, and we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. The next session is on Thursday, the 7th of July at 1600 UK time. The subject will be Russia's war on the Eastern Front of 1914, precedents for the current Ukraine conflict. Professor Alexander Watson will speak on the subject. He's a professor of history at Goldsmiths University in London, and the details will be on the website. So, ladies and gentlemen, and Andy, thank you.